Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular halacha shir. We're speaking about Kol Isha, the singing voice of women, and we learned all the basic sources, the principal sources from the days of the Mishnah and Gemara and the principal Rishonim from the Middle Ages in the Shulchan Aruch. We learned all the principal sources which lead straight to the conclusion that men are not allowed to hear the singing voice of women. It's true that the context in which the prohibition was formulated in the Gemara has to do with men who are in the midst of reciting Shema Yisrael, who are in the midst of a Kedusha activity where they must focus their attention entirely upon the Kedusha, and therefore you might think that the prohibition of hearing women's singing voice pertains only to those holy activities. Well, we saw the sources according to which the mainstream view, well, just about all the great poskim hold that the prohibition applies to men even outside of holy activities, just in general. Men are not allowed to hear the singing voice of women. We saw all those sources. And last week, we began to turn to some tiny aspects, some little room for leniency, which might exist in the words of some of the great poskim. And today we're going to broaden that little opening for leniency and see how wide open that could be made. Last time we finished off by looking at this lovely text from the Shulchan Aruch Harav. The Shulchan Aruch Harav, which we saw at the end of last week's class, was written by the first of the Lubavitcher Rebbes, and this book is not only extraordinary. Well, of course, in Chabad circles, of course, in Hasidic circles, this is the halacha book. But even outside of Hasidic circles, this is a very important and frequently quoted book. The Mishnah Brura quotes and relies upon this book virtually in every page of the Mishnah Brura. You'll find some reference, some point in which he relies upon this book. It's very influential. And he said that if a man who is accustomed to hearing a certain woman's voice, a sister, an immediate relative, someone who's accustomed to hearing her specific voice, well, no particular problem with that, even if she's married and we're talking about a potentially adulterous relationship, if there'd be any hanky-panky between them. And if he is able to totally ignore and blank out the singing voice and concentrate on the prayers that he's saying or Shema Yisrael that he's saying, if he's able to ignore her singing voice altogether, he also said there's room for leniency. Okay, that's what we saw at the end of last week's class. Now let's pick up with new stuff. The Ma'amar Mordechai. Ma'amar Mordechai was written by Rav Mordechai, and his last name, in the yeshiva world, they generally call him Rav Mordechai Karmi. But his name was not really Karmi. Let's get his name spelled correctly on chat in Hebrew. His name was not really Karmi, even though that's the way it's usually pronounced in the yeshiva world. He was from France, 18th century France, and he was the Rav of the town of Cremieux. Let's get that spelled. There we go. The Cremieux was the town where he was the Rav. And he was called Mordechai Cremieux. But when you spell Cremieux in Hebrew letters, it comes out looking like Karmi. So in the yeshiva world, you have to call him Rav Mordechai Karmi, or more frequently, he's just called by the name of his book, also quoted by the Mishnah Brura. Well, perhaps not on every page, but more or less every page. Very influential book. You call him the Ma'amar Mordechai, and everyone will know who you're talking about. You call him Rav Mordechai of Cremieux, and people will not know who you're talking about unless they know that he's from that town in southern France, which most people don't know. In any event, let's see what he has to say. Nira, it would seem, and no one told him that he had to publish this opinion just because he expresses himself in a modest way. It seems, in my humble opinion, that this is the position he's committed to. Ba'alma, in general, Eino asur elakisha mistakel v'shomea b'kavana. The singing voice of a woman is only prohibited if he is looking at her, not just looking. There's looking and there's looking. Mistakel is not a glance. He's not glancing at her. He is staring at her. He is gazing at her. He is ogling her. If he is staring at her and paying attention to her song, if he's focusing on her and her song, umiskaven lehenosba, and he's doing this because he has enjoyment, some erotic stimulation. He finds it enjoyable. That's prohibited. Wow. Well, you see, he's just succeeded in narrowing the scope of the prohibition to situations in which, number one, she is physically present and he is not only glancing at her, but staring at her, gazing at her, and he's experiencing some hana'ah, some enjoyment here. Kitamashma B'Tur, and this is implied by the words of the Tur and by the words of the Rambam. After all, they wrote, well, the Tur is just quoting the Rambam, it's the same words. Hamistakel, someone who gazes, not a passing glance, someone who gazes, afilu be'etzba ktana shel isha, even in a woman's smallest finger, v'niskaven lehenosba, and intends for that to be an erotic gaze. It says, though he's looking at her nakedness, afilu lishmoa kol erva, even to hear her sing, or lirot sa'ara, or to see her hair exposed. Asr, all this is prohibited. Well, you see the formulation of the Rambam, which is quoted then by the Tur Shulchan Aruch. It doesn't say flat out, but clearly implies that the prohibition of the singing voice of the woman is in place if he is mistakel, if he is gazing upon her, and considers it to be an erotic experience. That's why he's gazing. After all, just gazing upon her small finger. If it's an erotic gaze, that's prohibited. And then he concludes, these are still the words of the Ma'amar Mordechai, Mashma Behedya, this explicitly implies, those two words might not go together in general, but it's almost explicit here, Dekol v'se'ar dumiyah de'etzbaktana, that the rule of seeing a woman's exposed hair or looking at her finger, which is surely an exposed part of the body, all these laws, all these prohibitions work together with a single standard. Malahalan dafka b'kavana, just as one of them, namely looking at her little finger, which is a normally exposed part of the body, is prohibited only if it's an erotic gaze. Similarly, with her singing voice and her hair, if it's an erotic gaze upon the hair or an erotic listening to the song, that's prohibited. But if it's harmless, if it's innocent, then it is harmless and innocent. Now, of course, this puts the onus, this puts the burden upon the man to know himself. The man has to know whether or not this is an incidental glance or whether this is an erotic stare. The man himself has to know whether it's an incidental listening or an erotic concentration on the singing voice of the woman. Adraba, on the contrary, mashma milashono to kol v'se'ar ki leitzvei. It's implied by the order of presentation in the Rambam and the Tur. The Tur is just quoting the Rambam. It's implied by the order of presentation that hearing the singing voice is less strict than looking at the finger, than gazing upon the finger. Therefore, Kol Shomea Hakol Le'onso. Therefore, anyone who hears the singing voice of the woman, the onus, he has no choice. He's walking down the street and he hears the singing voice of the woman coming out of the window. Well, whatever the situation is, he has no choice. He's sitting in the somewhere, and there's background music being played. It doesn't matter what the situation is. He has no choice. It's just that the singing voice is being imposed upon him. A situation like that. Oh, ro'ez se'ara, or if he sees her exposed hair, Ri'iyah ba'alma, a passing glance, and he doesn't focus on her, he just happens to see, in a passing glance, her exposed hair. Shalom, no, there's no erotic aspect to this at all. Shari, all is well, and there's no prohibition. Well, the Ma'amar Mordechai has opened up the door to leniency, which we've seen previously. He's opened that door considerably wider. After all, according to this, the whole prohibition, beginning to end, has to do with whether or not there is an element of erotic stimulation. If it's innocent, if the listening to the music, if listening to the singing voice of the woman is innocent, then it is innocent. A clear example of that would be, his clear example of that would be, that if he's just walking down the street and he has no choice about it, he hears the singing voice of a woman who's singing in public or singing in her private residence, and the sound reaches him, he has no choice about it, and as long as he doesn't stop and focus his attention upon the singing, all is well. This is his example of a case which is clearly okay. To what extent this can be broadened to millions of other ordinary cases of men hearing women sing depends upon whether or not there is or is not an element of concentration, focus, and eroticism. Either there is or there isn't, and that varies depending upon the man, that varies depending upon the woman, that varies depending upon the situation, and this is something which the man is going to have to figure out whether or not he's gotten himself into a situation which is prohibited along these lines. That's the position of the Ma'amar Mordechai. Now, as we see more leniencies coming up down the road, you'll realize that this position, which was formulated back in the 18th century, is going to reverberate through the thinking of later poskim, more contemporary, more recent poskim, as we come to them more or less in chronological order. Now, the next of the great rabbis I wish to speak about is the Zemirot. The Zemirot, written by Rav Yechiel Michal Epstein, is one of the important 20th century works of rabbinic scholarship. Rav Epstein, and incidentally, that name is not well known in the yeshiva world. If you talk about the opinion of Rav Epstein, which we're about to learn, in the yeshiva world, not many people will realize who it is you're talking about. You have to call him by the name of his sefer. You say this is the opinion of the Zemirot. Oh, and everyone in the yeshiva world knows who you're talking about, the Zemirot. He's known by the name of his sefer. He was from Eastern Europe. He was from Lithuania, and he got a job as Rosh Yeshiva in Berlin. This was in the beginning, in the first half of the 20th century, and he indeed was the Rosh Yeshiva in Berlin when the Nazis came to power and closed his yeshiva and put him. Well, he was not put into a concentration camp. The reason the Nazis did not put him into a concentration camp was because he had come from Lithuania and he held a Soviet passport. He was a Soviet citizen. And the Nazis took all of the Jews who had Soviet passports and instead of putting them into concentration camps, put them into jails. Not that the jails were much better than concentration camps, but they were a little bit better. They weren't quite as bad as concentration camps. The Soviet citizens were put into jails by the Russians because put into jail by the Nazis. The Nazis intended after the war to trade the Soviet citizens with Russia, to trade them for German prisoners of war that the Russians had captured. Well, of course, that never happened, and after the war, he was released from the jail. His health, in the course of his imprisonment in that jail, his health was irrevocably ruined. He never really recovered his health after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, but he did live for a few years. He left Germany as quickly as possible after being released from that Nazi jail, and the last years of his life he spent in Switzerland, in the town of Montreux, in Switzerland. In any event, the name of the Sefer, Srideish, Remnants of the Fire, the Nazis had destroyed many of his writings. These are the writings which survived from the Holocaust, which the Nazis missed and did not destroy. So these are the Srideish, the remnants of the fire from the Holocaust. In the last years of his life, when he was living in Switzerland, he was the last of the great rabbis left in Europe after the Holocaust. All the other great rabbis had either been murdered by the Nazis or ended up in places outside of Europe. But in Europe, he was the last of the great rabbis left, and therefore the recovering Jewish communities in Europe turned to him frequently for halachic decisions on all kinds of issues that arose in the Jewish communities, which were trying to reconstruct themselves in Switzerland, in Holland, in all over. Yechiel Weinberg. Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. No, you're right. Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. You're right. Let's see what he had to say. The question which he's being asked, this is a tshuva, a response to a question, is as follows. After the Holocaust, there was a youth group, a Jewish youth group in France called the Ezra. The Ezra Youth Group. Ezra Youth Group still exists today. There's even a branch of it in my neighborhood here in Ramot, in Yerushalayim. It still exists today. It was a youth movement, rather like Akiva. B'nai Akiva and Ezra were a little bit competitors. The Ezra movement had its origins before the Holocaust in Germany, and after the Holocaust in France. The Ezra youth movement gathered together the Jewish youth who survived the Holocaust and tried to provide for them religious services. Among the things which the Ezra youth group did for the survivors of the Holocaust in France was they organized Shabbatonim, where the young people were gathered together and they had meals together on Shabbat with Divrei Torah, and they had shiurim, the kind of activities that youth groups always did and continue to do to this very day. Now, the following many problems arose. One of the problems which arose is the following. The members of the youth group who were gathered together by the youth group leaders in France had originated from many different places. Some of these young people were survivors from France. Some of them were survivors from Germany, some from Poland, some from Hungary, some from Lithuania. They came from all over. These are the young people who survived the concentration camps Some of them had survived in hiding, but there was no common cultural origin to them, aside from the fact that they were all Jewish and wanted a Torah observant youth group. Well, in Germany, before the war, where this youth group had its origins before the Holocaust, whenever they had a Shabbaton, whenever the young people would be gathered together for a Shabbos together, they would have their meals together with Divrei Torah and Shiurim. But among the activities, of course, they sang Zemirot Shabbat. They sang Shabbos songs around the Shabbos table. This is one of the things they did. And in Germany, before the Holocaust, the boys and the girls, we're talking about teenagers, the boys and the girls sang together. And that was a standard practice around the Shabbos table in the Ezra youth movement in Germany before the Holocaust. Well, the youth leaders continued the practices which they remembered from before the Holocaust. And here we have in France, boys and girls singing Zemirot Shabbat, Shabbos songs together around the table. These are teenagers. And the survivors of the Holocaust from places like Hungary and Poland were outraged. Because in Poland and in Hungary, Lithuania, places in Eastern Europe, these young people remembered clearly that women, girls and women did not participate in singing Shabbos songs because the men present were not allowed to hear the singing voice of women. This they knew definitively from the way life was before the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. And here the Torah observant, the nominally, supposedly Torah observant youth group is having the boys and girls sing together Shabbos Miras in France after the war. The youth group leaders turned to the Sri for advice. Should they stop this practice and not have the girls sing together with the boys? Or is it okay to continue? That's the question. Now, let's see his answer. His answer is as follows. Hareti, I instructed them. My answer to that question is as follows. This is what I told them to do. This Sri wrote. Menachem Yeshurun, Yeshurun was the organization which was in charge of all the youth movements. I told the administrators of the youth movements, sheyamshichu et pe'ulatam, they should continue their activities, including the singing of Shabbos songs, boys and girls together, teenagers. Al pi haderech shehitvu lachem gedolei Ashkenaz, they should continue their practices exactly as the rabbis in Germany had taught them before the Holocaust. The great rabbis of Germany told the youth leaders before the Holocaust, boys and girls should sing Shabbos Miras together around the table whenever you have a Shabbaton. Hayat Tzadikim Gedolim, those rabbis who instructed the youth groups before the Holocaust, those rabbis were great rabbis. They were great tzaddikim in Germany. The only thing those rabbis cared about was what was best for the sake of heaven, and they understood clearly that for the sake of heaven, what's important is for boys and girls to sing Zemirot Shabbat, Shabbos songs together around the table. Lahatzil et anoah mesakanat tmi'ah. This is one of the elements of saving the youth from assimilation. Shehit pashta ba'ashkenaz bimehem, assimilation which had become quite common in Germany in those days. The rabbis, the great rabbis of Germany, the tzaddikim, who were fighting against assimilation in order to preserve Torah observance in the next generation, knew that one of the important things to do in order to maintain adherence to Torah observance in the next generation and prevent assimilation, one of the things to do is to have Shabbatonim and boys and girls sing together. Now, um, this is a little bit strange because, after all the sources, almost all the sources we saw are strongly and definitively against this. Why, oh, why, how did the rabbis of Germany see room to be lenient in all of this? What was the basis of the thinking of those rabbis in Germany? He says as follows: "Bevo'ila Berlin." When I first came to Berlin, right, he was from Eastern Europe, the Sridiesh. He got his job as the Rosh Yeshiva in Berlin. When I arrived in Berlin to take over the position of Rosh Yeshiva, and he was invited to different homes, different rabbis, different homes. Families would invite him for Shabbos meals. When I arrived in Berlin, Ra'iti, I saw the Batei Haredim in the houses, in the homes of the strictest Jews, the strictest Torah observant Jews, the Haredim. I saw Mizamrim Anashim V'Nashim Yachad. I saw men and women singing Shabbos songs together. Not only teenagers, but the adults. Here I was at the Shabbos table, and the adult women, the teenage women, the adult women, the children, are all singing Shabbos mirrors around the table while I am there. And Shabbos mirrors, women singing with men. In Eastern Europe, there's no such thing. Hishtomamti. I was struck dumb. I was amazed. I was just struck dumb. I'd never dreamt of such a thing. Minhag zeh shu neged din meforish b'orach chaim. How can the Torah observant Jews permit this? In Germany, it seems to be a flagrant violation of the halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, which we saw last week. Shulchan Aruch says it's simply prohibited. After all, Kol Isha, the singing voice of the women, B'shas Kriya Shema, while the men are reading Shema Yisrael, and we saw it's extended even beyond that, simply usher. It's simply usher according to Shulchan Aruch. Why, oh why, were they doing that? Ishtamamti. I was struck dumb. So I asked, what's going on here? What's going on here? Why are the women singing? Marley, I was told, Ki HaGaon HaTzadik, Rav Ezra Hildesheimer Zal, great Rabbi Hildesheimer, who was the Sridieish's predecessor as Rosh Yeshiva in Berlin. Rav Hildesheimer was the founder of the great yeshiva in Berlin, the Yeshiva, which produced the vast majority of rabbis in Germany before the Holocaust. Rav Hildesheimer, Rav Ezra Hildesheimer, was the founder of the yeshiva. After he passed away, they called the Sridiesh to take his place. Rav Hildesheimer himself, V'chein HaGaon, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and also Rav Hirsch in Frankfurt, who is probably known as the greatest of the Orthodox rabbis of Central and Western Europe, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Those two great rabbis, one in Berlin, the other in Frankfurt on the Main River, Hitiru Zemirot Kodesh Lizamer Yachad. They told me that the leniency comes from those two great rabbis. Those two great rabbis are the ones who instructed the Torah observant Jews of Germany that men and women should sing together. Atam, and the reason, Mishum de Trei Kale Lo Mishtai. The reason is because Trei Kale, two voices singing simultaneously, Lo Mishtai, most people cannot distinguish well between two voices singing simultaneously. As soon as you have more than one voice singing, most people cannot focus on a single voice. I'm not talking about professional musicians. Of course, the choir master can listen to the whole choir singing, and if there's one voice that he's unhappy with, he knows exactly whose voice it is he's unhappy with, and he has to instruct that person to sing differently. That's a professional choir master. But most people hear multiple voices singing together and don't know exactly which is which, and therefore, as long as you have multiple voices singing together, you don't have focus, you don't have concentration, you don't have isolated concentration on a single woman. Kevan shemizarim yachad, since they're all singing together, ein chash isur. There's no reason to be strict here. There's no reason to be prohibitive. Well, you see clearly the idea of the Ma'amar Mordechai, which we mentioned earlier today, reverberating in the thinking of the great rabbis of Germany. The prohibition is if the man is focusing on that particular woman, and we're talking about a kind of erotic focusing. With multiple women singing simultaneously, or men and women singing simultaneously, as long as you have multiple voices singing together, then you no longer, for most people, you don't have any more the option of focusing on a single voice among the chorus. And that's the reason the great rabbis of Germany were lenient. Let's go one step further. Based on this, Lachain, therefore, these are still the words of the Sridiesh, Horeti lemanhige Irgun Yeshurun, therefore I instructed the administrators of this youth movement, the guys in charge of the youth movement, I instructed them, l'smoch, to rely, al Gedolei Ashkenaz. I instructed them to rely upon the opinions of these great German rabbis and be lenient. After all, Shahayu Biki'im, B'chochmas HaChinuch. It was the German rabbis who had expertise in chinuch, in education. The educational system set up by the great rabbis of Germany, the school of Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the educational institutions of Rabbi Ezra Hildesheimer, and the other great German rabbis were eminently successful, brilliantly successful in training the next generation to grow up to be Torah observant and to maintain Jewish traditions. The German rabbis knew what was necessary in order to maintain Torah observance in the next generation. Yad'u ruach b'not hador. The great German rabbis understood the young women in their society. Shehitchanchu b'batei sefer. The great German rabbis understood that the young women, girls and young women, were being well educated in secular studies, unlike in Poland, unlike in Hungary, unlike in Lithuania, where there's no such thing as secular education for girls. In Germany, the girls were getting a full-fledged, proper secular education. Lamdu leshonot. The girls studied foreign languages and foreign literature, mada'im, science, chemistry, you name it. The girls were getting a full-fledged education, secular education, just like the boys. Yesh lahem regesh shel kavod atzmi, and therefore the girls had a sense of self-respect, though different than the sense of self-respect that the boys had. They were educated in exactly the same way. And indeed, in Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's school in Frankfurt, the boys and girls in secular studies learned exactly the same material. In Kodesh, they were separated. The boys learned, back in those days, women wouldn't learn Gemara. Back in those days, the boys were given Gemara classes, and the girls were given more Chumash classes and things like that. For Jewish studies, they were separated. But for secular studies, they were together, absolutely identical. And the girls would think of it as being denigrating. The girls would think of it as being insulting, and the girls would feel rejected from Jewish society. If you tell the young women, and you tell the mature women, the young women, the girls, if you would tell them that they're not allowed to participate in Shabbos Zemirot, they would be insulted. They would feel rejected from Jewish culture, and that's not good. Lachein, therefore, hitiru l'nashim l'ishtatef b'Zemirot shel Shabbat, and that's why the great rabbis of Germany permitted, and not only permitted, but encouraged girls and young women, adult women, to participate in Shabbos Zemirot. They thought it's important. And why is it? We understand why it's important. It's important in order to maintain connection with Shabbos, in order to maintain connection with Torah observance. We understand why it's important. And why is it not prohibited? Because we're talking about multiple people singing together, and there's no reason to think that the men are going to be experiencing erotic focus on one specific woman. Anu ro'im v'yodim, and we know perfectly well, the Sri wrote, we see ourselves, and we know perfectly well, ki gedolei Ashkenaz, ki tzlichu b'chinuch habanot v'nashim tzirot. We know perfectly well, we see that it's the German method of educating the next generation which was eminently successful in raising young girls to be Torah observant and to be connected with Torah, to have spiritual lives, yoter, much more, the Gedolei Sharatzot, much more than other countries. The educational system instituted by the rabbis of Germany was far more successful in maintaining Torah observance to the next generation than any other place, surely more than Poland, surely more than Lithuania, more than Hungary, more than all the other countries put together. It's the German rabbis who knew what had to be done, and part of the program was men and women, boys and girls, singing together Zemirot Shabbat. The Ashkenaz in Germany, Ashkenaz means Germany, the Ashkenaz, before the Holocaust, Ra'inu Nashim Melumadot, Uba'alot Darga Haskala. In Germany, before the Holocaust, we saw plenty of educated, Torah-observant women, Gevolha, with higher education, university degrees, and they occupied high positions in society. We saw plenty of Torah-observant women occupying, highly educated women occupying high positions in society in Germany before the Holocaust. Hayu charedot al dat Yisrael. They were very Torah observant. Mekayamot et mitzvah b'hitlahavut, and they were fervent fulfillers of all the mitzvahs of the Torah. In Eastern Europe, there was no such thing as women attaining high levels of scholarship and therefore having high positions in society while still being Torah observant. There was no such thing in Eastern Europe, but we saw that's what happened in Germany. Mishum kach, therefore, ein anu marhiv, therefore we dare not prohibit. Ein ani marhiv, I dare not prohibit. La'asor, mashitiruhem, I dare not prohibit what the great rabbis of Germany permitted. Not only were they correct in being lenient, but they were necessarily correct. It's something which we need. All kinds of things might be permitted. Doesn't mean you should go out and do it. This is not only permitted, but this is something which you should do, because this is part of the program which succeeds in maintaining Torah observance. In something like this, in a situation like this, ne'amar, we say, Et lasot lashem heferu tarasecha. In a situation like this, we say, even if you come from a Jewish background in which you think this is prohibited, this is the time to reverse your position. This is the time to change horses. If you come from a Jewish culture in which you think this is prohibited, like many of the young people came from Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, and so forth and so on, Romania, this calls for a change of position in order to save the next generation for Torah observance. Well, the Sridiesh is quite emphatic about the matter. Not only is it permissible for boys and girls, men and women, to sing Zemirot Shabbat together, but that's something which they should do, because that has proven itself as an important element of the program in maintaining commitment to Torah and mitzvahs. He adds one more sentence at the end of the tshuva, Makol Makom, in any event, Ein lachuf al hanashim. In any event, the young women should not be compelled. Shetzrichot lishtatef b'Zemirot Kodesh. The young women should not be forced to sing Shabbos Miras if they don't want to. A young woman, an adult woman, any woman who doesn't want to sing Zemirot Shabbat, there's no reason why she should be forced to do so. Im yitratu lahachmir al atzmam, a specific woman who wishes to be strict and refrain from singing Zemirot Shabbat, Chalila, heaven forbid, lil'oz alehem, heaven forbid that we should mock her, ulhitlot setzba, or to make fun of her. So, although he was instructing the leaders of the youth movement that it's good, proper, and to be encouraged that men and women, girls and boys, young people, adults, males and females sing together. All that's good. Although that is good and something to be encouraged, you can't mock, you can't make fun of a woman who wishes to be strict. After all, the strict position prohibiting the women from singing has great sources to it, and therefore we cannot object to a single person who wishes to be strict, or a group of people who wish to be strict. Now this idea of yesh makom lahachmir, let's get that spelled correctly on chat. Yesh makom lahachmir is an idea which not only runs through the thinking of the Sridiesh as we see, it's also an idea which runs through the thinking of many other poskim. For example, the Igros Moshe, or Moshe Feinstein, the greatest of the rabbis of North America in the 20th century, also lived in a place, New York, where there was a gathering of Jews from many different cultural spheres. Jews ended up in New York from everywhere. And of course, they came to New York with varying practices. Some communities were stricter on this and more lenient on that, divergence of practice on many, many things. And often, when the lenient Jews saw that their Torah observant neighbors were very strict on some point, the lenient ones would get nervous, and they'd ask Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, are we just making a mistake? Are we just wrong to be lenient on this point, or is our leniency justified? That was a very common form of question that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was asked. The typical form of the structure of his responses usually followed exactly the same kind of lines as the Sridi Eish. Al Pi Din, according to halacha, according to the principal sources of halacha, the lenient side is fully justified. But remember, the strict side also has sources to rely upon, and therefore, although it is correct to be lenient, you cannot mock and you cannot make fun of the people who are stricter. That too is a valid approach. Yesh makom lahachmir, there is valid room to be strict on many issues, on many matters, and people who choose to do so, we surely we surely have to be at peace with them. That's a very common approach, not only the Sridi Eish, but also Rav Moshe Feinstein and many others. At this point, we're going to turn to the next big issue, not only Zemirot Shabbat, but all kinds of songs, whether it's Zemirot Shabbat or not. And now we're going to turn to the question of the disembodied voice of the woman. As we have only the voice, but not the physical presence of the woman. That's a complicated way of saying that we're speaking about radio transmissions and recordings. We're on the recording or the radio transmission. All you have is the voice, but not the physical presence of the woman. Let's see what the great poskim have to say about that. First, we're going to see the strict opinion. Strict opinion is is represented by the Chelkas Yaakov. Chelkas Yaakov was Rav Yaakov Breish. Rav Yaakov Breish, originally from Eastern Europe. After the Hungarian Revolution, he was among the many Jews who escaped from communist Hungary during the Hungarian uprising, and he ended up in Zurich, in Switzerland. This is what he had to say about recordings and radio transmissions of the singing voice of women, voice without the physical presence of the woman. Here's what he says. Eini yodea shom heter. I know of absolutely no basis for leniency. The Kol Isha, regarding the prohibition of the singing voice of a woman, al yedei radio. Just because it's a radio transmission, that doesn't make it any less erotic. That doesn't make it, that's no reason for leniency. There, af agav the mavua besota, even though it says in the Gemara, let's take a look at the words of the Gemara for a moment, and then we'll understand how the Chelkas Yaakov relates to the Gemara, how he understands the Gemara. The Gemara says, Allah Rava. Rava says in the Gemara, the Gemire ein yetzer hara sholet ella b'masha einav rod. Gemire, he says. Gemire is a technical term in the Gemara, which means we have a tradition that teaches us. Gemire. We have a tradition which teaches us, Rava said, that the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, it's a polite way of saying eroticism, sholet, dominates a person, as a person is subject to erotic stimulation, only with what he sees with his own eyes. Erotic stimulation enters through the eyes. That's a tradition. We've learned by tradition, Rava says, that things which are prohibited by halacha because of eroticism has to do with the vision of the eyes. Well, this passage in the Gemara, these words in the Gemara, these words in the Gemara have only to do with ongoing erotic thoughts after the song is finished, after she is no longer present, when you are alone. What Rava meant is that if you actually see the woman and experience erotic stimulation, then that will influence your thoughts, that will stay in your mind, and the erotic influence will remain in your mind even later when you are in private. Oh, but כששומע את קולה והוא נהנה, but if you hear her singing voice and you find that attractive, if you are attracted by her singing voice, zehu ha'isur, that is the prohibition, v'have erva. There are two different things going on here, according to the Chalkas Yaakov. Visual exposure to eroticism is not only prohibited now, but continues to have impact on your thoughts later on, and the erotic thoughts will continue. Passing exposure to only the voice, but no vision, that can be erotic while you are hearing the voice, which is prohibited, but what Rava meant in the Gemara is it's not going to have any ongoing impact on you. Ki kolech arev. After all, what the Gemara says about Kol Isha, and we saw all these sources 2 weeks ago, where the whole prohibition is learned from the verse in the Torah, which calls the kol, the singing voice of the woman, arev, pleasant. After ein yod'a umakira, the singing voice can be erotically attractive, even if you have no idea who it is who is singing. And therefore, the fact that she is not physically present is irrelevant. She could be behind a curtain, she could be in a house somewhere. It's the voice alone which is prohibited, and therefore there is no room to be lenient regarding recordings or radio transmissions. Hare erva bashishit asur. After all, exposure to erotic stimulation is prohibited even in a mirror. You don't actually see the woman in the mirror. All you see is her reflection. Doesn't matter. A reflection in a mirror can be erotically stimulating. You don't need the physical presence of the woman in order to have a prohibition. Shama erva hiari. After all, in a mirror, you see what you see. Asur, afshe'en bershuto. Even if she's not physically present, still seeing the woman in the mirror can be exposure to something which is erotically attractive. B'shmiya, as far as listening is concerned, not a mirror, but in concept very similar. B'shmiya, as far as listening is concerned, hearing is what's prohibited. And hearing a radio transmission is in concept analogous to seeing something prohibited in a mirror, not physically present, but you see it in the mirror, not physically present, but you hear it coming from the radio or the recording. Gamkein, afshe'ena bershuso, and this is true whether she is present or not, you don't need her physical presence in order to have a prohibition of eroticism. The afgam kishe'ena roeota, even if you cannot see her, kevan de'ika bakani ashmiya, since the prohibition is hearing the singing voice, well, whether you can see her or not is irrelevant. Whether she's physically present or not is irrelevant, and therefore the singing voice of women is equally prohibited in person and in recordings or radio transmissions. Disembodied voice is equally prohibited with hearing the song in the presence of the woman. That's the strict position which is formulated by the Chalkas Yaakov, and many rabbis today continue to embrace this strict approach. Now let's look at the lenient position regarding recordings and so forth and so on, recordings and radio transmissions. The lenient position is that of the Tzitz Eliezer. Rav Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg. He was born in Damascus, but he spent all his life really here in Yerushalayim. He was for many years the head of the Bet Din HaGadol, the leading rabbinic court of the chief rabbinate here in Israel, and he's the author of this series of volumes, the Tshuvot, the Tzitz Eliezer. I just forget, the last volume was 21, a total of 21 volumes. And we're quoting now from the 5th volume. Let's see what he has to say about recordings and radio transmissions, or any situation where the woman is not physically present with the man. Hashalo Kenegda, if he's not in her presence, Hakol Dovad, Ushin Nishma, it's only her voice which he hears. Balafanov, only her voice comes before him, and not her physical presence. If it's only the voice, Azai Mutar, then it is permissible. Mekevan Shelo Yuchal Lavo Listakel Ba, because if she's not physically present, there's no way that he can look at her. If he's not physically present, then it's simply impossible for him to gaze upon her. There can be no erotic gazing if she's not there. So if it's only the voice, only the singing voice permitted. Now we have to understand the reasoning behind this. Let's see how he explains it. Odzot, further. Kisha hakol hu al yedei radio, if the voice is coming through a radio transmission, there's an additional reason to be lenient. Not only because she's not physically present, but here's a whole new reason to be lenient with radio transmissions. Latir would be permissive, mipnei, because Eze Kol Isha mamish. Turn on the radio, you listen, you turn on the radio and you listen, you are not hearing the voice of a woman. You are hearing vibrations created by the loudspeaker in the radio. That's not a woman. That's a mechanical device which is vibrating and imitating the sound of a woman. There's no woman here. It's just a good imitation. Depending upon the quality of your audio equipment, the imitation of a woman's voice will be better or worse, but it's never the voice of a woman. It's always just the vibrations in the air created by the loudspeaker or the earphones, but it's not the sound coming from the vocal cords of a woman. There is no woman. There is no woman's voice here. All it is mechanical vibrations of a loudspeaker or earphones, and that's not erotically attractive. Ella ovrim kechetef kama gilgulim ad shenotza mechadash havarat hakol. The original voice of the woman, which went into the microphone in the studio, that original voice undergoes all kinds of electronic changes until it finally comes out of the loudspeaker, and that's like an echo. It's not the original voice anymore. It's no better than an echo. It's not the voice of a woman. It's an echo. That's all it is. The lo kamo shekotav bazeh b'sefer Yom Gadol l'Rav Toledano. Rav Toledano from Morocco, who is strict on this issue, is incorrect. The radio Kol Isha Korei Ba'atzmo Nishma La'ozn HaShomea. Rav Toledano incorrectly thinks that somehow the voice of the speaker on the radio, or the voice of the singer on the radio, somehow that voice travels through the wires and comes out the other end. That's not what happens. That's simply not correct. It's not like it's not like a long garden hose where you speak or sing into one end of the garden hose, and at the other end, it's that voice coming out. That's not the way radios work. It's a whole new creation. The voice you hear, the sound you hear, is a whole new creation, not a woman's voice at all, just a machine vibrating. Well, we're beginning to see why the Tzitz Eliezer is lenient about the disembodied voice of the woman. We're going to pause at this time, and in Yetz Hashem, next time we will complete this topic. Until then, I wish you a good week and eventually a Shabbat Shalom. I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Till then, Shalom, Shalom.